Now, what are your thoughts on the fact that Christopher and I both date Asian women? His falling in love with a nice Jewish girl would have pleased me from the start. The public is persuaded it's love and compassion when a child shows up in a celebrity's house. Adoption, however, was occasionally used as damage management in vintage Hollywood. Records are sealed, identities are changed, and pregnancies are concealed. 10 recorded instances of youngsters being renamed, moved, or enmeshed in tales created to music, preserve reputations rather than the truth were presented tonight. If you believe that adoption is a non-issue, thousands of children will tell you that you are completely mistaken. I'm Jane Russell, and I'm requesting your support for waif. Farrow Mia. Mia Farrow and her former spouse, Andre Previn, adopted Soon-Yi Previn in 1978. She was raised mostly out of the public eye in a large family with both biological and adopted children. Throughout her youth, Sun-Yuni was primarily secluded and avoided acting, in contrast to some of Farrow's offspring. It was made known in the early 1990s that Sun, who was a young adult at the time, was romantically involved with Mia Farrow's longtime partner, Woody Allen. Despite the fact that Allen was neither her biological nor legal parent, the revelation caused a global uproar. Although the relationship was legal, it significantly altered public perceptions of family boundaries and brought up long-standing moral dilemmas of proximity, authority, and trust in intricate adoptive family systems. Yi soon wed Allen and openly supported their union, but Farrow called the revelation a terrible personal betrayal. Although the adoption was lawful and typical, the result was one of the most upsetting family splits in Hollywood history. What started out as a compassionate gesture resulted in irreversible divisiveness, causing long-lasting harm to all versions of the story. Michelle Laura Lee, adoption, legal case, and disappearance. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, child actress Laura Lee Michelle starred in a number of Hollywood productions. She was adopted at a young age by Otto and Lorraine Michelle, who took direct control of her acting career when she was born Virginia Joy Willilliford in 1940. From a young age, her life was governed by legal and child welfare supervision in addition to studio contracts. After claims that Laura Lee was being abused by her adoptive parents, a custody and welfare case made its way to the courts in 1950. Physical punishment and severe control over her meals and daily schedule were among the allegations, which were said to be related to keeping her appropriate for child roles. Both the child's own assertions and accounts in current news were contradictory. In the end, the court decided not to cancel the adoption, and the Michaels were still granted possession. Laura Lee's movie career quickly fell apart. She struggled with instability as an adult, was briefly imprisoned for auto theft in the early 1960s, and then mostly vanished from the public record. Although the surviving documentation is still lacking, later reports speculated that she may have passed away from cancer in the late 1970s. Neither protection nor long-term stability came from her adoption. Rather, it concluded with a life lost between the boundaries of legal action and Hollywood's production machine, as well as quiet and unanswered questions. Margot, Betty Davis. Margot Merrill was adopted in 1951 by Betty Davis and actor Gary Merrill. In sharp contrast to Davis's powerful public persona as a strong and unyielding celebrity, Margot had severe cognitive and developmental impairments from an early age. This adoption, in contrast to many others in Hollywood, was never included in advertising campaigns. Margot's existence was mostly unknown to the general public. Margot spent the majority of her life in specialized care facilities as the severity of her ailment became apparent. Davis used extremely tactful language and infrequently mentioned her daughter. Journalism from the studio era largely shunned the topic, reflecting Hollywood's general unease with realities that challenged its image of power, prosperity, and control, as well as the stigma associated with disabilities at the time. Margot spent the majority of her life in institutional care and spent nearly all of her time apart from her mother's public existence. There was minimal public re-evaluation and no redeeming plots. Neither a controversy nor a sentimental story emerged from this adoption. Rather, it faded into almost complete quiet, a life molded by absence and a sector that was mainly unable to accept vulnerability when it could not be turned into a picture. Dion Anthony Stanwyck, Barbara Stanwyck, and Dion Anthony Fay. In 1932, Barbara Stanwyck, who was married to actor Frank Fay, adopted a kid named Dion Anthony Fay. Music.
The adoption publicly matched the studio's desired stable image. A child representing domestic normalcy, a decent home, and a successful actress. The press paid little attention to the issue beyond brief announcements. The child's existence was regarded as private from the beginning and purposefully kept apart from Stanwyck's meticulously cultivated public image. A few years later, the marriage failed, and the custody issues grew more tense. According to biographical reports, as Dion, music, neared puberty, Stanwyck's connection with him grew more strained. He lived away from her for long periods of time, and their frequent communication decreased. He was never portrayed as a part of her career legacy or integrated into her public persona, in contrast to many other celebrity children of the time. Dion avoided public interaction with his adoptive mother as an adult and separated himself from her. Although he didn't often speak in public, the biographical narratives that are accessible indicate that a long-term emotional connection never fully formed. In this instance, adoption served mainly as a formal agreement with no enduring emotional bonds. When a child no longer fits the framework of the star's existence, he is publicly acknowledged but then discreetly removed from the story. Legal instability surrounds adoptions at Jane Russell International. Adoption was openly marketed by Jane Russell as a religious and moral cause. After becoming an adoptive mother herself, she established the World Adoption International Fund, WAIF, in the 1950s, portraying it as a humanitarian endeavor aimed at matching foreign-born children with American families. Russell framed international adoption as a moral cause and a personal duty, and he often discussed religion, compassion, and moral responsibility. In reality, the group was caught up in moral and legal issues. WAIF worked in an era when there was no regulation of international adoption, which resulted in cases where children were moved across countries without consistent legal protections, ambiguous documentation, and contested parental consent. Court challenges and regulatory investigation followed a number of the organization's adoptions, exposing systematic flaws rather than individual administrative errors. These cases were a part of a larger period of controversy that brought international adoption practices to the attention of the public and institutions. Russell insisted that she had good intentions and that there was no proof that she made money off of the enterprise. Still, there were serious repercussions. Families were split up. The romanticized story of humanitarian rescue gave way to bureaucratic chaos and long-lasting harm, and children were left in a state of protracted legal limbo. Even when adoption was motivated by genuine intentions and conviction, it could result in permanent harm. Ronald, Roxanne, and Mary Pickford. During the early years of Hollywood, Mary Pickford was hailed throughout the world as America's sweetheart and a representation of purity, hope, and affection. The media portrayed her and her husband Buddy Rogers' adoptions of Ronald in 1943 and Roxanne in 1944 as a logical progression of her meticulously developed public persona. Many people presented them as comforting tales of moral stability and familial harmony. A markedly different private atmosphere is described by biographical sources and subsequent testimonies from the children. Pickford upheld high standards of behavior and rigorous discipline. The children were expected to closely resemble the idealized family image linked to her public character. Affection was scarce, criticism was common, and emotional expression within the home was strictly regulated. Ronald and Roxanne discussed the emotional effects of growing up with continual expectations and constraints as adults. Adoption turned into another regimented role behind the meticulously maintained facade of Hollywood's most adored star, one that was characterized by emotional restraint, obedience, silence, and rather than ongoing parental closeness. Hollywood linked families, Georgia Tann, and kidnapped children. Despite not being an actress, Georgia Tann had a significant impact on the Hollywood social scene. She established a statewide adoption program as the director of the Tennessee Children's Home Society from the 1920s until 1950, matching newborns and young children with affluent and well-connected families across the country. Publicly, these adoptions were portrayed as both lawful and altruistic. In reality, a large number of children were removed from low-income or vulnerable moms using deceit, fabricated consent forms, or removal under duress or false pretenses. Subsequent inquiries revealed widespread record tampering. Original identities were deleted, birth certificates were changed, and biological parents were misinformed that their children had passed away. Adoption costs were collected in a discreet manner. Social services monitoring was either non-existent or weakened, and cases were
Accelerated through cooperative or inadequately investigated court processes. Politicians, legal professionals, and families with ties to the entertainment sector were among the adoptive households. The system depended on social acceptability, silence, and the widespread notion that wealthy houses were intrinsically better, even while many identities were sealed or purposefully hidden. After years of unanswered complaints, the operation was eventually the focus of a public investigation in 1950, but Georgia Tann passed away before any criminal charges could be brought against her. As a result, thousands of adopts were left with false identities and no trustworthy way to trace their roots. This was not a singular instance of abuse, rather, it was a systematic rewriting of family history that took on in the open for decades while society and the government did little to stop it. Zaisa Pitts, her son, and Barbara Lamar. One of the biggest stars of the silent era, Barbara Lamar, had a speedy rise and a quick fall in her career.
She was seriously ill before the age of 30 due to TB, addiction, and unstable finances by the mid-1920s.
Being separated from her spouse and approaching death, she started to worry more and more for her small son's future. Lamar made arrangements for the boy, legally named Marvin Carville Lamar, to be permanently adopted by fellow actress Zaisa Pitts and Pitts' husband Tom Gallery just before she passed away in 1926. This was not a temporary guardianship, it was a full legal adoption.
The boy's name was changed to Donald Michael Sonny Gallery after the adoption.
The arrangement was presented in newspapers as a friendly gesture. The decision's finality was rarely examined. At the same time, the child lost his mother, his last name, and his public persona as Barbara Lamar. He was more frequently identified by his adopted name alone in public documents and subsequent press reports following 1926. Even family histories could be discreetly deleted in early. Accelerated through cooperative or inadequately investigated court processes. Politicians, legal professionals, and families with ties to the entertainment sector were among the adoptive households. The system depended on social acceptability, silence, and the widespread notion that wealthy houses were intrinsically better, even while many identities were sealed or purposefully hidden. After years of unanswered complaints, the operation was eventually the focus of a public investigation in 1950, but Georgia Tann passed away before any criminal charges could be brought against her. As a result, thousands of adopts were left with false identities and no trustworthy way to trace their roots. This was not a singular instance of abuse, rather, it was a systematic rewriting of family history that took on in the open for decades while society and the government did little to stop it. Zaisa Pitts, her son, and Barbara Lamar. One of the biggest stars of the silent era, Barbara Lamar, had a speedy rise and a quick fall in her career.
She was seriously ill before the age of 30 due to TB, addiction, and unstable finances by the mid-1920s.
Being separated from her spouse and approaching death, she started to worry more and more for her small son's future. Lamar made arrangements for the boy, legally named Marvin Carville Lamar, to be permanently adopted by fellow actress Zaisa Pitts and Pitts' husband Tom Gallery just before she passed away in 1926. This was not a temporary guardianship, it was a full legal adoption.
The boy's name was changed to Donald Michael Sonny Gallery after the adoption.
The arrangement was presented in newspapers as a friendly gesture. The decision's finality was rarely examined. At the same time, the child lost his mother, his last name, and his public persona as Barbara Lamar. He was more frequently identified by his adopted name alone in public documents and subsequent press reports following 1926. Even family histories could be discreetly deleted in early Hollywood in order to maintain order and prevent scandal. These have been isolated catastrophes until now. What came next was not intimate. It was a systematic issue. Christina Crawford and Joan Crawford. Everyone has watched the film. The book was read by several of us. However, it was only lived by Christina. There was nothing in place to protect kids when I was a child.
Nothing.
Sadly, my adopted mother did all in her power because she was so envious of my success.
In 1939, Christina Crawford moved in with Joan Crawford.
In 1940, while the studio system was purposefully reshaping her career and public image, the adoption was officially completed in Nevada. The adoption was portrayed in publicity brochures as proof of Crawford's development into a responsible, disciplined, and morally pure woman. Fan publications regularly featured carefully posed photos of the actress with her adopted kids, which helped to maintain the perception of a neat and model Hollywood home. Christina Crawford provided a radically different description of the realities behind that image in her 1978 memoir, Mommy Dearest. She claimed physical punishment, humiliation, and compulsive control over conduct, appearance, and daily routines, describing a family atmosphere characterized by dread, strict discipline, and emotional abuse. Christina claims that the adoption served more as an extension of control and less as a manifestation of maternal care, with the child expected to live up to her mother's public image. Christina and her brother Christopher were specifically left out of Joan Crawford's bequest following her death in 1977. This decision was eventually contested in probate and settled. The family story was irrevocably shattered when other adoptive children openly disputed Christina's account of what happened. Adoption in this instance did not provide about stability or a sense of belonging, rather, it created long-lasting trauma and a public controversy that only came to light when the star lost control of the narrative. Young Loretta Lewis Judy. Well, I was 23 years old and 2 weeks away from marriage when I first learned who my father was. Loretta Young was one of Hollywood's most closely guarded celebrities in 1935. Her public persona, which was constrained by studio contracts, placed a strong emphasis on moral rectitude, Catholic virtue, and self-control. She became pregnant by her married co-star Clark Gable while filming The Call of the Wild. In the strict moral code of the studio system of the 1930s, an unmarried pregnancy was considered a scandal that would ruin a career. Young was removed from view under the pretext of a protracted period of rest and international travel in order to avoid public exposure. In fact, with the help of middlemen linked to the studio system, she was transported to a remote area where she secretly gave birth. In order to avoid public visibility and potential discovery, Judy was placed into foster care and spent a large portion of her first 19 months outside of Young's house, including time in a Catholic orphanage before Young picked her up. Loretta Young formally adopted the child and publicly announced the decision as a charitable act after the immediate scandal risk had passed. I resembled my dad. I inherited my father's enormous ears. I always wore bonnets to hide my ears when I went out in public with her. Prior to discovering that Loretta Young was her original mother as an adult, Judy Lewis was brought up with the belief that she was adopted. Lewis claimed in her memoir, Uncommon Knowledge, that the long-standing lie had a significant impact on her identity and changed her connection with her mother for good. One day, after returning from school, I entered my living room to find music artist Clark Gable standing there. Hollywood maintained its morally upright image, the child paid the emotional price. The clean narrative went to Hollywood. The kids had to deal with the fallout. Please like, subscribe.